To support our discussions with the world's leading thinkers, please see the video description or visit eism.eu/support. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the Executive Director of the European Institute of Science and Management and host of this channel. Today we have the privilege of talking to Kevin Mitchell, a professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. Professor, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Luis. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, you were nice enough to accept my invitation to talk about a book that you recently wrote called Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. In my opinion, you've written a really timely and important book. Before I explain why, and before we get into the details of the book, I hope it's not impertinent to ask you to set aside all modesty and tell listeners what makes this book unique and why people should read it. When you're done, if it's okay, yeah. I'd like to share my own reasons why I think it's so important.
So, I think it is timely too. I hope that it is. And part of the reason why I think it's timely is because we're learning more and more about how the brain works. And there can be a trend, I think, among some neuroscientists and sometimes in the way that that science is portrayed, to make it seem like as we're learning about these, the mechanisms that are there in the brain to figure out how we make decisions and so on, that actually it just reduces to mechanism, that it's all machine, right? We're getting so much power, so much insight from neuroscience. It looks like we can see this bit of the brain active when you're doing something. We can go in animals, we can control what they do. We can, we can implant memories in animals and so on. It really feels like we're getting control of the machine. And there's a danger in that the person, then the self, just dissolves away, right? It just gets eliminated in that kind of a framework. And I wanted to try and push back on that, and for my own sake, for my own sanity, to try and figure out how it can be these two things the case at the same time. One is that, yes, our cognition and thinking and everything about us relies on the physical substrate of our brain and the activities of neurons and so on. And yet we are still a real thing. Ourselves are still a real entity with causal power. And the answer, it's not obvious. I mean, when you get into that sort of sense of physicalism, that where our brain is just a physical system, it's really hard to get away from the idea that physics, never mind just neural circuits, but really just low-level physics, is just driving everything. And so what I wanted to do was find a way where, without violating physics or invoking any kind of magic, we could still see that the self is an entity with causal power, that we can be agents in the world, that we really do control our decisions, not with absolute freedom, but within degrees of freedom, that we can act on the world as causal loci of causal power. And I think it's timely in a broader sense when we may be faced with a kind of feeling of global helplessness around the kind of challenges that we're facing. It doesn't help to constantly be hearing that actually we have no free will and we're just robots and machines. So that was my goal, was to push back against that kind of view and show that we can get a scientific framework to explain that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head in your last couple of sentences there. The pushback is necessary and needed. No, it's this idea that we're just robots, mechanical agents, doesn't leave any room for the fact that the planet is full of nuclear weapons, for example, and to think that there's nothing that we can or should do about that, and there's no free will. It just seems like, on its face, it seems like, as you write in the book, it seems absurd, and that we should be suspicious of this idea. So I think it's important for your book for three reasons. One, in true goal-oriented fashion, you end your final sentence, which I'll read in a moment. You end the book on a really important note. So the idea that we have goals toward which we aspire, I think, is fundamental to human nature and fundamental to our continued existence as a species, right? So on the one hand, you end with the following quote I'm going to read here. So we have, as individuals and as a species, the power to transcend the immediacies of our own biology. And though as I write this, the global prospects seem gloomy, we have within our reach the possibility of wisdom, of making optimal collective decisions for the long-term survival of our planet and all of the wondrous life forms on it, if we choose to exercise it. So I think this approach, we have the choice whether to decide whether we want to survive or not survive. So I think this is key, a key aspect of your book. And if I were to talk to somebody like Robert Sapolsky, who you've had a great discussion with, who takes the opposite view that there's no free will, I'd like to ask him what that means for the fact that the planet is full of nuclear weapons. Can we do anything about that, or can we not? No, on the one hand. If you just give me one more second, I'll give you two other reasons why I think your book is really important. And some of this is already caught in what I've just said, but the idea that interpretation matters, right? Somebody like Robert Sapolsky looks at the same science that you'd take a look at, but they interpret it in a different way. So this idea that interpretation, we can look at different things in a different way and interpret them differently. Your book highlights this fact, but it comes down on the side of common sense and on the side of we can do something to make humans thrive and survive more, right? And the last one, maybe you'll be surprised. I think the reason your book is important, your approach is important. In some sense, Hume, of course, is famous. Philosopher Hume is famous for having said, you can't derive an ought from an is. Maybe I'm wrong, but in some sense, what you've done here and what you're arguing for is that we can derive an ought from an is, because to the extent that our goal is to continue to exist, we should do, or we ought to do, that which physics tells us we should do to continue to exist. So in some sense, you derived an ought from an is. So on any of these 3 points, would you like to comment or
Yeah, I mean, they're all, thank you very much, first of all, and they're all really interesting points. I think the last one to me is really key, right? So what I wanted to do was try to, I guess, re-legitimize the idea of purpose. So purpose to me is crucial in biology, but it's been a dirty word for decades, I think. You know, we've taken a very mechanistic turn. I think biologists had some kind of physics envy, and we wanted to couch all our explanations in terms that didn't need to invoke the idea of purpose. And I think it's absolutely central to what life is. And it's a different, there isn't a purpose in the lifeless universe, but there is purpose when living things emerge because they want to persist in the sense that that's a sort of a tautological thing when it, you know, for the first sort of organisms, the ones that persist better continue to persist and therefore we see them, right? And they survive. And so what that means is that anchors the idea of some behaviors being good for relative to the purpose of persisting. So you get value and meaning, right? Not just information, not just physical forces. You get different kinds of causation in living organisms, and I think that's really, really key. And it scaffolds up, right? I mean, we start with these very basic purposes that are just hardwired into us by evolution. But when we develop cognition, when we can start to think about things out in the world, we can develop other kinds of goals, right? Not these very distal ones, but much more proximal goals that are much more context dependent. So, for example, we have a goal to survive. And in order to do that, we need to eat. But right now, I'm not eating something because I'm talking to you. But later on, I'm going to, and then I'm going to decide what I'm going to eat and so on. Right? So it's all very, very much contextualized. But of course, many of our goals, what humans develop is these longer-term goals, right? We can juggle more and more variables at once. We can have nested kinds of projects and plans, long-term plans that we're hoping to achieve. And in the context of those, we then reset our current goals. So if, for example, I was on a diet, then maybe I wouldn't eat even though I'm hungry, right? So we get these levels of control that that I think allow us to optimize towards very long-term goals. And in the broader context, you can just scale up that idea to first of all, to pro-social behavior and culture, right? Being able to have a goal of having a good reciprocal relationship with another member of the species means that I might subjugate an immediate goal, like me taking more of the food, for example, right? So those are the kinds of things that allow civilization to emerge. Basically, is that we can have those higher order social goals that contextualize our immediate, more personal goals, and that is the kind of thing that you would hope we could do on a planetary scale, right? Because we know the problems facing us. We know actually what many of the solutions are. And right now, we're just not doing them because we haven't, because we're on a, sort of a national scale, we're still competing against each other. And we don't have a level of global cooperation that would allow us to, again, subjugate those immediate goals of individual players towards a collective good. And so there's nothing new in that idea. Of course, everyone, it's well known in economics and political science what the tensions are between individual actors and collective good, and this trade-off between the cost that you have to put into something versus the benefits that you can get out of it. But it's interesting to me that those dynamics are already at play in individual organisms as they go about their daily lives. And I think that we can learn something from that neuroscience about how such decisions are made, how we optimize over all those variables at once, without having to say, oh, it's just a machine working, right? We can really say, no, what the machine is doing is that thinking to optimize over those goals. That's what's happening. It's just that it's instantiated in some neural machinery. So I mean, on the broad sort of scale, and I didn't dwell on it, but it's why I ended the book on that point, because I think it is important that we can think about the principles of decision making and cooperation and competition and everything else that we can learn about from individual organisms, and we can hopefully scale that up and see how it applies to the same science, but at a more sort of national scale or global scales.
Exactly. And I think you've taken the reader in a very masterful way from almost from fundamental physics all the way up through evolution and the evolution of biology, how a living organism, in order to maintain its existence or its homeostasis, has to have a kind of a looping interaction between the information it has about itself and the environment. In some sense, is this not what happens in a democracy, that individual persons are reading the information from the environment, having their own conceptions of self, and then just taking actions to improve what they perceive to be their own lives or their own existence? Is there a parallel, a direct parallel, or do you think there's more complicated than that?
I mean, I think there's analogies, and I think that some of the abstract sort of mathematical principles at play are actually the same, right? They're literally the same principles at play to a certain degree. What's interesting you can make an analogy, I think, with a multicellular organism, right? Where the organism as a whole only works because all of the individual cells within it are directed towards the same goal, right? And in fact, what they're doing is they're ceding some of their individual agency to the good of the whole organism.
Mhm.
And I mean, you can see sort of tensions there, and you can see the analogy to different political systems where, for example, in the United States, it's a very individualistic kind of foundation to the political system, with the idea of individual rights having, sort of more primacy than collective responsibilities, frankly. Whereas in other situations, it's the opposite, both sort of legally and culturally. And each of those has their own benefits, their own drawbacks, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about where the problem situations really arise when you get a tension between individuals who are looking to optimize their own benefits in the short term versus their collective effects on everybody else, and the idea of advancing everyone's benefits, but that taking a longer time and requiring a cost and an investment from every person. So it's easy to have people who will just cheat that system. And this goes to really fundamental kind of social cooperation amongst different animal species, where they've evolved mechanisms to keep track of who's given what to whom, who owes what to whom, and whether those debts are being repaid, whether somebody is taking more food and not paying it back later on, and so on. So we have the same kind of systems in our cultures. We have the same kind of systems in our laws, and sometimes they work well and sometimes they don't. I guess what I would say is that they don't work well when they're corrupted. Right? When there's some other forces, you could design a system that works great, but then when you have some other forces come in, it just means that those systems just don't work as they should. And I mean, again, to look to the United States, for example, the effect of lobbying money and influence of huge corporations on the political system and the way that it works is an obvious sort of corrupting influence on the way that system is supposed to work, right? It just doesn't work the way it's supposed to work because of that kind of thing. And, again, on a global scale, I think we can see those sorts of things being played out that stymie the progress that we need to make.
Yeah, excellent. This idea that that there's an analogy between the mathematics that's taking place on a cellular or multicellular cellular organism level and society is actually something that we're actively researching and investigating. We're leading a multidisciplinary consortium now, looking for funding from Europe, precisely to do this, to apply the mathematics that you talk about in your book. You don't talk explicitly about the mathematics, but the underlying mathematics that governs the dynamics that you talk about in your book, to apply that to different voting systems and voting algorithms. And like you said, we think there's a lot of potential value and understanding to be had from understanding the algorithms, right? The algorithms that underlie these physical processes, and to apply them to how we make collective decisions. So
Yeah.
That's going back to the last sentence that you end your book with, that we have the power to apply these principles. We can decide to apply them or not to apply them, to ignore them. So that's very interesting. The idea of interpretation, you don't really talk about it in your book directly.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share? Because, for example, in your discussion, yes, please.
Yeah, thanks. I actually I'm writing something about this right now, because it's really interesting, I think, probably for many readers, if they're comparing my book and my stance on this issue with that of Robert Sapolsky, whose book came out just around the same time. And so Robert is also a neuroscientist. He looks at the same data, that I look at. He looks at the same sort of bodies of evidence, but he comes to very, very different conclusions. And usually when that happens, it usually means there's a starting premise that's different. There's some underlying philosophical position that we have that differs between us, that means that we just interpret things in a different way. And so I'm trying to sort of dig out in Robert's book what those positions are, because they're not necessarily made explicit, but you can kind of worm them out by saying, okay, well, if he interprets this way, or he concludes this from these facts, then the only reason he would do that is if he thinks this, right? And of course, you can do the same kind of archaeology on my own philosophical foundations for the way I'm thinking about the problem. And to me, the main sort of issues that where we differ is that Robert has what feels to me like a very mechanistic view of living things, kind of almost a behaviorist view, which in the history of psychology was this sort of movement where you shouldn't really worry too much about what's going on inside there. We can't do experiments that way because we can't get at it. So we should just look at the behavior of animals and just sort of operationalize things, excuse me, in that way. So
May I pause very quickly?
Sure. Yeah.
Talking about behaviorism, one of my first, fun fact for me anyway, one of my first psychology classes was with B.F. Skinner, and he was talking about his behavioral approach.
Really?
So he
Wow.
was very old at the time, of course, but it was very interesting that I think back on this.
Yeah.
This was in the 80s, so this was still his impact was still quite influential even then.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fascinating to hear. It would have been, I'm sure, an amazing class to take. He was so influential. But what happened is after is behaviorism fell away as a sort of an edict that we weren't allowed to think about those things when the cognitive revolution came around, when it turns out that we could think about things. We can think about thinking. We can devise all kinds of theories about how those work, about how cognition works. And that it's not that it's solved or anything, but it's a very active area. But we can think that cognition is really doing something, right? That it's not just mechanical whirring or algorithmic churnings in a deterministic kind of a way, but the organism itself has to consider lots and lots of variables and make its own mind up as an entity. And that's where Robert and I also differ, because I think Robert has a very reductionist approach, where essentially it sort of eliminates the idea that the cognition itself is doing any work, that the contents of the thoughts or mental states have power in and of itself, as opposed to the vehicles of the states. That is, the neurons firing is where the real causation is happening. So I think there's both a behaviorist and a reductionist view that Robert sort of brings to the table. But then there's also oddly a dualist view, which is really weird. So the idea of dualism, as I'm sure you know, but I'll explain, is that it's a sort of a solution to the idea of free will or agency that basically says, well, okay, yeah, there is physical stuff that obeys physical laws, but there's also mental stuff. And that's a whole different kind of thing. There's a mental realm, and we can decide things in this mental realm, and then that can be executed in the physical realm. And that's just, due to René Descartes. The problem with that was pointed out to him very, very early, that it doesn't solve this question. Well, how does this immaterial mental stuff push any physical stuff around? And it's a huge challenge. So the idea that there's a sort of a ghost in the machine or an immaterial soul or self that's guiding things just isn't a scientific solution, right? And that's why dualism is not a common position among scientists. But my feeling is that Robert has a kind of a closet dualism, which is weird because he's such a physicalist otherwise. So his argument is that as we learn more and more about the neuroscience of decision making, we reveal these mechanisms, the space for you to inhabit and to exert any control just shrinks and shrinks. And his thesis is that it will continue to shrink to such a degree that it will just disappear, right? It's a kind of a God of the gaps argument. There's nowhere left for you, this immaterial you, to be. Therefore, it's all machine and it's all deterministic. Whereas, I think you can have a perfectly naturalized view of the self, which is just not reductive. Right? It's still a physical view. It's still physically instantiated by your brain. It's just not reducible to these neural mechanisms or any particular isolated bits of the brain. So there, I think, is where we really, really differ, is that I guess, bring a non-reductive materialism, and he brings a reductive materialism. And for me, I think we can have a science of selves and subjects, which isn't woo-like, it's not mystical, it's really, hardcore science. I mean, you mentioned in our discussion before we started recording that you're working with Karl Friston, and Karl has a perfectly respectable scientific framework of selves and subjectivity that I think is totally serviceable and not mystical at all. So yeah, I think that interpretation, the differences in our interpretation come from probably some underlying philosophical positions that we just differ on.
Excellent. Our take on interpretation, I hope it makes sense. And I think it goes to the opening statement that I made about the importance of your book, is given two different interpretations, one should opt for that interpretation which is most helpful or gets us out of the predicament we're in as a species.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that your interpretation gives us much more ample room, besides being common sense, right? We experience that we have free will, that democracy makes sense. I can't imagine what democracy even means in a world where we don't have free will. What are we just going through the motions? It seems, like you say, it seems absurd on its face.
Yeah.
So that interpretation, which gets us to the next step and says, okay, we have free will, we have a dangerous situation or dangerous situations on the planet at the moment. How are we going to overcome these situations? I think that interpretation is much more preferable than one that has nothing to say about it. So
I mean, I agree, and I think the fatalistic, nihilistic conclusion that you would ultimately have to come to logically, if you think every action that every person takes all the time is completely determined by past events, is just super unhelpful and dark, frankly. And just not well supported by the science, and it doesn't match our everyday experience and phenomenology. So I think to make an extraordinary claim like that, you would need extraordinary evidence. And actually, it's being presented on the basis of very weak evidence and to my mind, very weak arguments. But I think you've hit something that I think is really important, which is a kind of a pragmatism, right? And so living organisms make decisions in just the most pragmatic, efficient, egocentric kind of way possible, right? So what they're trying to do is not figure out the exact right thing to do in some absolute sense. They just need to figure out what's the best thing to do that I can do right now with the information that I have, given the goals that I have. So it's an exercise in efficient decision making that is contextualized based on the goals, the plans, the commitments of the individual. And I think that when you come to sort of discussions about morality and moral behavior and so on, I think that's really interesting because, some people would argue that these sort of, absolute objective moral values that just sort of exist somehow, that just hold in the universe, that some things are just good or bad, whereas I would take a much more pragmatic view to that some things are good or bad relative to the goals of some entities. And if there aren't any entities, there's no goodness or badness, there's no value. But once you have entities, there is real value. And then what you get is, of course, differing goals, right? You have two entities. Well, now maybe they have conflicting goals. So what's good for this one may be bad for that one. And that, of course, is what, that gets back to these issues of the tensions between cooperation and competition. And what we've learned as a species, and what we know from economic theory and so on, is that actually cooperation can just generate benefits for everybody, right? It's not a zero-sum game. And that, for me, is the key thing, is that we get growth in economic terms, or we get success in evolutionary terms by cooperating that benefits everybody who's on board, right? Everyone who's cooperating benefits. The challenge, again, is that some people who are not cooperating, who are not paying that cost, may also benefit, right? So they may be freeloaders. And that's where the tension arises. But yeah, on a global scale, you just would love to see that the set of goals being actually articulated and laid out so that everybody can see everyone's going to benefit by solving climate change, right? Everyone's going to be screwed if we don't. And so, but yeah, the problem is who does that job, right? Who articulates those things? Because there's, we don't have one global government, right? So we have instead the tensions. That's the situation we're in now. And yeah, I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an economist. I can see some parallels, but I certainly don't have any solutions to those problems.
Well, that's fascinating. They're very, very interesting. What our response would be that who determines is nature determines. And I think you would agree that nature determines ultimately what lives and what dies according to physical and mathematical principles, right? We might think that a certain behavior is okay, but over the long term, and it might be okay for my lifetime, but over the long term, maybe my group just ceases to exist.
Yeah.
And from the perspective of my group, then that decision that was made was a bad one because I don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So nature ultimately decides.
Yeah. And what's really interesting there is that, we humans have this cognitive time horizon that is basically infinite, right? We can think about our sun going out. We can think about the heat death of the universe, right? I mean, millions, billions of years in advance, right? We can entertain those possibilities. And evolution has given us that capacity that I think really transcends what other animals can do, where most animals are thinking in, the here and now. Some animals have developed the capacity to think, somewhat further in advance, days or weeks. But probably not years. I don't think chimpanzees are thinking about what's going to happen a year from now. So that capacity is really what has allowed us to colonize every niche on the planet, because we have that kind of flexible behavior that allows us to anticipate and predict things in the world far in advance so that we can survive. But of course, it's also allowed us to to overrun the planet, right? And so at some point, we're going to have to recognize that we're destroying things, and we're destroying our own environment and ecosystems, and the ecosystems of our children and grandchildren. And that, for me, is the only saving grace that I think we could hold on to here to be optimistic, is that ultimately, while we could be making selfish short-term decisions for ourselves, we're also wired to care about the welfare of our children and grandchildren. And so hopefully that will pay off, right? That's the thing that we can depend on to drive our goal setting for these very far future goals, right? And to say, well, okay, right now we're going to have to pay some costs to make sure that those things exist even after I exist.
Excellent. Well, this human capacity for long-term goals, I think, is so important and fitting. No, it's what makes your book so critical and timely, I think. Well, you mentioned this idea that well, actually, we talked about the project that we're involved in, that were looking for financing. On the one end, we have political theorists and social choice theorists and economists. At the other end of the extreme, we have theoretical physicists. And this goal-oriented approach is something that unifies all of these various scales of analysis and science. And I was reading your book with fascination, great interest, and I was struck by the fittingness of one physicist's approach to this. His name is Yakir Aharanov, and he's famous for his work has been very influential, especially the two-state vector formalism. In some sense, it's a mathematical formalism that approaches fundamental physics and explains a lot of the mysteries that we see at the subatomic level by understanding that there's two types of causes. So this causation is an important part of your book, I think, and the nature of cause and time. And so what he posits is that we don't really understand cause if we only think of it as cause as coming from the past to the future, but we have to think of how the future also has an impact on how we experience the present. So this I see as relevant to your take on time and cause as a process. Can you elaborate on that and why it's relevant to your book?
Yeah. Well, that sounds fascinating. I'm going to have to look into that. So, I think the concept of time is key to understanding life. Life is a process of continuity through time. That's what living organisms are. That's what it means to be a self or an entity, is to keep being that self through time, right? To keep yourself organized in a particular way as a pattern of processes and stuff through time, right? And so there's a kind of a fascination in the free will debates, and actually also in the experimental science of the neuroscience of decision making, with momentary decisions, usually between binary outcomes, right? And even the thought experiments of most philosophers are framed like that. So right now you have a choice between A and B, which you're going to do. Where is the control coming from? Is it from you or is it from something else? To me, that misses a lot of the actual nature of behavioral control of living organisms, which is that they're agents, they have agendas. They have goals, which are desired future states. So for me, there's not a causation from the future back to the present. This is a forward-looking causation, but it's because the organism wants the world to be a certain way, and it's going to just choose an action to make it that way. Right? That's basically what goal-oriented behavior is, and I think we can do that without violating physics, or the arrow of time. So yeah, I think that the notion of causes there then has to be extended, right? So we typically think of causes in this Newtonian billiard ball kind of a way, or at the level of quantum mechanics, we've got forces. Most people think of causes as physical forces. Those are the real causes of things happening, and everything can be boiled down to that. That would be, I think, the ultimate sort of articulation of reductionism. However, you only get forces when you have some organization of stuff, right? If everything were homogeneous, there would be no forces. You only get forces when there's sort of an inhomogeneity. So the way that a system is organized is effectively needed to get any of that efficient causation happening. So you can have constraints as causes, and this is one of the big themes of the book, which is that we can have a science of organization that is every bit as fundamental as these low-level laws of physics. And partly that is only allowed, right? That it's only possible that the organization of a system could have some causal power if it could be organized some other way, right? And so if the low-level laws of physics were completely deterministic, if we knew the positions and momentum of all the atoms in some system, some closed system, and we applied the laws of physics, and the next state was completely determined, and the next and the next and the next, well, then that would be causally complete. There wouldn't be any room for anything else to affect it in a causal way. But it's not the case, right? So physics says that isn't true, that actually those low-level details and the laws of physics underdetermine future outcomes because there's some randomness at play. There's some indefiniteness that has to be resolved. And that opens some causal slack for the organization of the system to impose some constraints and to partly settle what happens. And it's funny that many people seem to resist that idea or find it weird, or again, like it's invoking some kind of magic or violating physics. It's not that you're going down and you're messing with the randomness. It's just that you're setting some boundary conditions on the system, right? You're setting some initial conditions, some boundary conditions, and that's going to constrain how the system can evolve. And because there are possibilities at play, and because through time you can have selection of which possibilities persist, then you get some functionality, and you get some design work that's done by evolution in the same kind of vein that design work is done to constrain, to design the laptop that I'm talking on, that constrains where the electrons are flowing within it. It doesn't change the laws of physics. It just adds another level of control. And living organisms are evolved to have those kinds of functionalities within them that allow them to exert control from a higher order level down to a lower level. And in fact, one of the key points that I think is really undermines the idea of complete neural and physical reductionism, where all the causes are at those low levels, is that actually a lot of those details in the brain don't matter. They get averaged out, they get coarse-grained, they get filtered out actively, actually, from one neuron to the next. A lot of the patterns that are happening, the details don't matter. What this neuron does is extract the pattern from that neuron. It's the patterns that matter because the patterns mean something. And ultimately, in our brains, when we're thinking about something, we're basically manipulating patterns of neural activity that have a meaning. And so we're really doing cognition. It's a real thing. It requires some neural instantiation, but the details at any moment of the neural firings are somewhat arbitrary and incidental. It's the global patterns that matter, and that's where the causal sensitivity in the system lies. And so for me, that's a solution to this problem of mental causation that we talked about earlier. How could the mental stuff reach down and push the physical stuff around? The solution to that is that the mental stuff is physical stuff, right? It's a physical pattern of neural activity, but those patterns only have causal power in the system because of what they mean. So to me, you can have I'm sort of tentatively calling this position cognitive realism, just for want of a better term. Well, the idea is that just because neuroscience reveals those mechanisms doesn't eliminate the process, those processes of cognition, it illuminates them. Right? So it shows us how they work. It doesn't say they're not real or epiphenomena. So yeah, I think so. So thinking about causes in that way broadens our scope, fits just generally with the fact that actually organizing things we know has causal power, right? I mean, that's how we design things. It's why we pay football managers so much. So yeah, I think that broader view of causation is important. And I think the diachronic view, that idea of extension through time, is crucial when we're thinking about living things, because that's what they are. They are extensions through time, right? It doesn't make any sense to think of an organism as a momentary physical system. That's just, you're not capturing what it means to be a living thing when you have that sort of reductive, instantaneous view.
Yeah, excellent. This is so fascinating, so interesting. This reminds me a little bit of the work of Earl Miller. We've had him as a guest in the past, and some of his latest work on electrical activity in the brain demonstrates this, exactly what you've just been talking about, the fact that these patterns can have a top-down effect on the actual physical structure of neurons. and not the other way around. So that's very, very.
I mean, I would say actually, rather, I would phrase it slightly differently. Rather than saying not the other way around, I would say as well as the other way around.
That's right. That's right. He says the same thing, as well as the other way around. Exactly. There's a two-way approach. And I think that's so interesting about the two-state vector formalism, because this is precisely what it posits. And it, unlike other approaches to quantum mechanics, this is actually, it's not philosophy. It's not philosophy at all. This has actually led to new, novel experimental results. And it's had a tremendous impact. It's been baffling to me to understand why it has not been more well known. It's really I don't understand why. I suppose it's because of cultural reasons. The reductionist approach has been dominant for 400 years or so. I suppose people are still reluctant to change their mind about that. But that goes again precisely to why I say your book is so timely and important on so many different levels. I'd like to talk now about the idea of attraction and repulsion. And here I'm struck by, speaking of the scientific revolution, at the outset, Isaac Newton, in his Principia, in the preface, I'm paraphrasing here, he basically says, look, this is the best I've been able to do. This is my understanding of nature. I wish I could understand attraction and repulsion, because I suspect that everything else can be derived from attraction and repulsion. So with this as kind of a background, can you talk about attraction and repulsion and the role that it plays in your own thinking and in your own research and in your book specifically?
Sure. That's so interesting to me. I'll say so as a graduate student, I studied how the brain develops. In a very, very simple organism, the embryo of a fruit fly, where we could follow individual nerve cells. So a nerve cell, when it's born as an embryo, is dividing, the cells get born, and it's just a little round cell, but it has to connect with somebody, right? So it has to extend this long kind of fiber, and the fiber is led by this structure called a growth cone, which is actually looks like a hand. It is sort of feeling its way, exploring what's out in the world, and then it's moving in response to that. So it's basically a sensory motor machine, or, well, I shouldn't say machine, an organ. And the way that it's guided is that there are some attractive cues in the environment and some repulsive cues, right? So some proteins that it detects that are expressed over here that it moves away from, and some that it's sort of wired to move towards. And what's really interesting is that different neurons express different receptors on their surface that make them sensitive to these landscape of cues in different ways. So what might be attractive to one neuron that has to go this way might be repulsive to another neuron that is supposed to go that way. So so I really started actually my scientific career thinking about these sort of mechanisms of attraction and repulsion at the molecular level in a developing brain. But I think what's really interesting is that I think, and so in the book, I start in thinking about agency with the simplest organisms that we know, which are single-celled bacteria. And you can look at the behavior of those bacteria as basically approach or avoid. Those are the decisions that they have. So they're self-contained, obviously. They have a cell membrane and a cell wall that differentiates the inside from the outside. So they're an entity that persists through time. And in order to do that, they have to take in energy. So they have to get food. So it helps if they can sense what's out in the environment and figure out where there is food. And one of the things they'll do is they'll move more towards a food source and so on. But they'll also can move away from things, right? So they'll move away from very crowded conditions or high temperature or high pH or, something that's threatening. And on that basis, right, that simple idea of approach or avoid, I think we can understand so much decision-making. So much of our own decision-making, it basically boils down to approach or avoid. Do I want to do this? Do I want to get away from that? And you can just sort of make it just much more sophisticated, but the underlying principle, I think, is very much the same. So approach avoid is one of the basic dynamics of decision making. And then there's another one which is related to that, which is equally important, which is explore, exploit. And that terminology actually came from economics, but it applies very well to living organisms. So again, you've got a little bacterium. It's in some area, it's been dividing, so there's lots of other bacteria around it. There may be a food source there, but the food source may be running out, right? Because the bacteria are just eating it all. So at some point, it's going to have to move. It's going to have to stop exploiting its current resources and explore for some other ones. And again, that dynamic is really, really interesting in a meta-cognitive kind of a way, because you can scale that up to very sophisticated things that we do, even to the point of, say, of scientific theorizing, say. So when we're involved in some scientific enterprise like psychology, say, and we take a certain approach like behaviorism, at some point that may be working, it may be a productive kind of paradigm, but then it may reach a point where people go, you know what, this is just not paying off as we thought. We have to do something different. We have to back off. We have to challenge our assumptions, stop exploiting this particular way of doing things, and explore for other ways of doing things. So, and you may recognize Thomas Kuhn's sort of idea of a paradigm shift in science. And I think that the same principle applies when we're just individually thinking about things that we can do. We've got some goals, we're trying to achieve them, but maybe we're being frustrated. Maybe we're not achieving them. And then we may have to kind of go back to the drawing board and think of new ways to do that. What's really interesting is that there are some specific neural systems that we can use to increase widen the search space for options. So we may have certain habitual ways of thinking about what to do in given circumstances, which typically may work well in familiar scenarios, but when something changes or we're in a novel scenario, we may have to kind of cast a wider net for ideas. And there are specific systems that basically increase the randomness in the brain to shake up the neural networks, to kind of reset the network a little bit and let it find some other areas, let it escape from these sort of local minima that were quite stable and productive, but now are no longer. So yeah, I think it's fascinating to identify these basic principles, basic building blocks of decision making. Approach, avoid, explore, exploit. There's a few others that, yeah, they apply at an economic level. They apply at the level of an individual bacterium deciding what to do. And those are the moments when I feel like I've learned something, right? When you can find a correspondence like that, an underlying principle that, again, I would say is every bit as fundamental. Those systems principles are every bit as fundamental as the physical forces of quantum mechanics and so on. I think they just kind of hold in an abstract sense, and that biology can find them, evolution can find them in an exploratory kind of a way.
Well, fantastic. There's an advantage, we argue, to taking this approach avoid schema, in the sense that it boils down, or the force, if you will, the physical force that governs this behavior is at the cellular level is largely electromagnetism. And then we have the Coulomb's law, which governs electromagnetism mathematically according to the inverse square law, right? So the inverse square law, the force that falls off, right, according to the square of the distance. And so what we're doing is applying this concept at the political level and exploring with our city partners. We've partnered with a number of cities here in Europe to toy with to experiment with the algorithms in democracy. So there's an actual real connection between these ideas and the physics and the math that underlies them to really, we believe, make progress in how we come to make wise collective decisions. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think, can I just add, I think, that
Sure.
there is, of course, a mathematics of the physical forces, and you can model lots of things in that sense with those formalisms. I think what's really important is that there's a mathematics of informational causation as well, right? Which is where there isn't a transfer of energy or momentum or matter. There's a transfer of information, like when a bacterium senses something outside. You know, it has a protein that spans the biological membrane. It binds something outside, and it just causes a conformational change inside. So there's no energy transferred. That's not the nature of the causation. It's just not a physical force. But the system is configured in such a way that when the confirmation is like this, something will happen, or it will be interpreted internally in a certain way. And building up that kind of formalisms for that kind of informational causation, and I want to say semantic causation, actually, because the information has meaning, is really, I think, an exciting area these days, and there's lots of people working on those kinds of formalisms.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm not familiar with the informational, this informational, how did you phrase it? Informational causation.
Yeah.
But it does ring a bell with the physicist I mentioned earlier, Yakir Aharanov. He is the co-author with Bohm of the Aharanov-Bohm effect, which demonstrates, I think, precisely this, the effect of information at a distance. And it's quite fascinating, really interesting. Okay, as a final final part of this exchange, I'd like to ask if the physics, for example, of the principle of least action is somehow relevant to your approach or to what we've been talking about, because the principle of least action, of course, is a very fundamental principle where a subatomic particle moves in such a way as to maximize its experience of time or proper time. In fact, Juan Maldacena, who's one of the leading theoretical physicists on the planet, refers to this not coincidentally as the principle of maximal life. So even at the subatomic level, like that quark level, particles move in such a way that they want to continue to exist for as long as possible.
I hadn't heard it articulated that way before. That's really interesting. So, I mean, my understanding was that in Hamilton's original formulation is that the action was this sort of, I don't know what it's called, like the Lagrangian or something. It's a combination of kinetic and potential energy, a mathematical formula that includes both of those terms, that tends to get minimized in a way that is such a fundamental observation. But and yet I've yet to find a physicist who can explain to me why that is. Like, if you know, as a child, if a child asks why, at bottom, the last answer to the last why seems to be because of the principle of least action. And then there's nothing beyond that, which it does my head in, frankly, trying to figure it out. But what's really interesting is that there's this sense that some people see that as agential, right? Like the quark, like you said, is trying to maintain its existence for as long as possible, or the photons off there's an explanation when you put a pen, say, in a glass of water, and it looks bent. The reason it looks bent is because of the change in refractive index from the water to the air, means that the path that the photons take is the fastest one to get to your eye if they're follow the track that would make it look bent to the observer, which is just a weird thing, right? It does sound agential, like they want to take the fastest path. So, I mean, ultimately, in the big metaphysical sense, I just don't know what to think of a lot of that. In the more immediate sense, in terms of it being a useful formalism, I think it is effectively equivalent to the free energy principle that Karl Friston and colleagues have developed, or at least they map onto each other very closely. And you can formalize a lot of what organisms are doing in terms of them wanting to minimize their free energy, which is another way, a sort of a mathematically formalizable way of saying that they have some desired states that they may be deviated from those states, which they can take as an error and an increase in free energy. And what they want to do is bring them back into where they should be. Right? Mm-hmm. So that's just, in a sense, it's homeostasis. Right? You've got systems, control systems that are put in place to monitor your states, to monitor the state of the world, to come up with some actions that would be that have their utility measured in how well they will get you back to your desired states. So yeah, all of that is a framework that I find super interesting. I have to say, a lot of the mathematics is above my pay grade. I regret, but at the same time, I don't 100% know what to make of it, because sometimes some of the proponents will say this is a useful way of talking about what's happening here, and it's a useful way of doing the mathematics and modeling it. Whereas at other times, sometimes the same people or some other proponents will say the mathematics is what's happening. It literally is doing this. It's not just a model. It physically, the physics just is this thing following the free energy principle or the principle of least action. And again, that's a really big sort of metaphysical claim, and I also don't know what to make of that. But I will say on a pragmatic level that I think that mathematics is very useful, and people are using it, for example, to make artificial systems that are capable of being agents at some level of behaving in the world and figuring out what to do and having some internal states and so on. So yeah, leaving the metaphysics aside, if those sorts of formalisms are useful for designing systems that provide a test bed for our theories, then that's what really gets me excited about them.
Exactly. No, I agree with you. Going back to this idea that among different interpretations, we should prefer those which have a practical impact on the things that matter to us as humans, the primary of which is long-term survival. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, last question, and I will want to be respectful of your time. Last question: what's next for you and your book?
Yeah. Well, so the book. I mean, I'm really gratified by the response to the book, and I really appreciate the kind words that you've said yourself. It feels like, yeah, there's kind of a moment happening, right? There's an interest in this topic because of these wider pictures, right? These wider problems. I mean, it's almost like we don't have time to mess around claiming we don't have free will. We've got things to get on with. So let's figure out something of the science of decision making and see if that's useful. I don't take that to be my job at all, because there are other people better qualified in these other disciplines. But if presenting that kind of a picture is helpful to that, then I'll be really, really delighted. So if the book can have an influence beyond just being of interest to readers, then I think that, yeah, I'll be thrilled. And then, yeah, so that's my hope, I guess. And yeah, then after that, well, I've got some other ideas whirring around.
Fantastic. We didn't get a chance to talk about your previous book, Innate, but I would have loved that. And perhaps we can come back one day and talk about that. I didn't mention that I had the privilege of being mentored by Richard Herrnstein at Harvard, who, of course, wrote the famous bell curve, which was really, really influential on me and my own studies. And a lot of my current trajectory is stemmed from his work. So it'd be interesting to talk about intelligence and genetics. And
yeah, well, I think if we might disagree on some of those points then.
Okay, fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time today. It's been an honor and a privilege. Thanks for the great book you've written. I think it's an enormous service to humankind. So thanks again.
Thanks very much. It was really my pleasure. Thanks, Reese.